At 9:17 a.m. on January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George lay motionless inside the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. Through the glass of a rifle scope his fellow officers had mocked for 6 straight weeks, he watched a banyan tree 240 yards away. He was 27 years old, an Illinois state rifle champion, and despite weeks of combat, he still had 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. In the previous 72 hours alone, they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. Every patrol that moved through the trees paid a price. Men vanished with a single crack. Others dropped mid-sentence. The jungle itself had become the enemy. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. Other platoon leaders gave it a nickname, his mail-order sweetheart. When George had unpacked the Winchester Model 70 at Camp Forest, Tennessee, complete with a Lyman Alaskan scope mounted in Griffin and house steel, the battalion armorer laughed and asked whether it was meant for deer or Germans. George told him it was for the Japanese. The rifle didn't make the initial deployment. The 132nd shipped out before it arrived. George crossed the Pacific watching other officers strip and clean their M1 Garins while his own rifle sat forgotten in a warehouse in Illinois. He filed request after request through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant finally handed him a narrow wooden crate stamped fragile. Inside was the rifle George had spent 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. It weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces. The standard issue Garand carried by every other man in the battalion weighed 9.5 pounds, with no magnification. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds. The Garand was semi-automatic, 8 rounds. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. The Marines had been fighting there since August. They had taken Henderson Field. They had held it under constant attack. But they had not taken Mount Austin, and they had not cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanuca River. Mount Austin rose 1,514 feet above the jungle. The Japanese called it the Gifu. 500 defenders, 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 days. 34 men were killed. 279 were wounded. When the western slope finally fell on January 2nd, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. Point Cruz was different. There were no concrete bunkers here. No fixed defenses. Just Japanese soldiers who had retreated west from Henderson Field and disappeared into the massive trees. Banyans. Mangroves. Trunks wide enough to swallow a man. Some of those soldiers were snipers. And they were killing Americans every day. They carried scoped Arisaka Type 99 rifles. They understood the jungle the way city men understood streets. They knew how to wait without moving. How to disappear into bark and leaves. How to kill and vanish before anyone knew where the shot came from. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he knelt at a creek filling canteens. On January 20th, another sniper cut down 2 men from L Company during a routine patrol. On January 21st, 3 more Americans died. One was shot clean through the neck from a tree the patrol had already walked past, twice. That night, the battalion commander sent for John George. The snipers, he said, were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know whether George's mail-order sporting rifle was anything more than dead weight. George didn't argue. He listed facts. Illinois state rifle champion in 1939, 23 years old at the time. The youngest winner in state history. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards using a Lyman Alaskan scope. The commander listened, then gave him until morning. Prove it. George spent the night preparing his rifle. The Winchester had crossed the ocean packed in cosmoline. He cleaned it again anyway. Checked the Griffin and how mounts. Verified the scope alignment. He loaded 5 rounds of 30-06 standard military ball ammunition, the same cartridge fired by the Garand. He had packed the rounds himself back in Tennessee, just in case this moment ever came. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position. The ruins of a Japanese bunker captured 3 days earlier overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reports said the snipers favored banyan trees, some towering 90 feet high, trunks thick enough to hide a man completely. A sniper could climb before first light and sit there all day, unseen, unmoving, lethal. George brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition and stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began to scan. The Lyman Alaskan offered only 2.5 power magnification. Not much, but enough. Enough to catch movement the naked eye would miss. The jungle never went quiet. Birds shrieked. Insects droned. Artillery thudded far away. George filtered it all out and watched for what mattered. Movement. Left to right. Top to bottom. At 9:17 a.m., he saw it. A branch shifted. No wind. Just a slight movement. 87 feet up a banyan tree 240 yards away. George waited. The branch moved again. Then the shape resolved. Dark clothing. A human form tucked into a fork where 3 limbs met. The Japanese sniper faced east, watching the supply trail George's battalion used every day. George made a 2-click wind correction. Slowed his breathing. The Winchester's trigger broke like glass at 3 pounds, 2 ounces, set that way months earlier at Camp Perry. Now it mattered. George squeezed. The rifle cracked. Recoil drove the stock into his shoulder. 240 yards away, the sniper jerked, then vanished from the branches. His body fell through the banyan canopy and hit the ground hard at the base of the tree. George worked the bolt. The empty casing spun free. A fresh round slid into the chamber. He stayed on the scope. The jungle had more eyes. George kept his eye pressed to the scope. The banyan tree stood still now. No movement. No second silhouette. But he knew better than to relax. Japanese snipers did not work alone. They operated in pairs, shooter and spotter. If he had killed the gunman, the spotter would be close. In the same tree. Or another nearby, already watching the bunker. He shifted his attention to the surrounding canopy. The Lyman Alaskan's 2.5 power magnification forced discipline. He couldn't sweep quickly. Every inch of bark, every shadowed fork in the branches had to be examined methodically. Banyan trees were monsters. One trunk could support several men without revealing them. The jungle light fractured through leaves, turning shapes into illusions. At 9:43 a.m., he found the second man. A different tree, 60 yards north of the first. Lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was climbing down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot. He understood what it meant. His position was compromised. George tracked the movement, led slightly, and fired. The second sniper fell backward, losing his grip. His rifle struck branches on the way down, metal clattering through leaves before both man and weapon hit the jungle floor. 2 shots. 2 dead. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His hands were steady, his breathing slow and controlled. The process felt familiar. Camp Perry. Wind flags. Paper targets. The only difference here was that the targets were trying to kill him. At 11:21, a Japanese round slammed into the sandbags 6 inches from George's head. Dirt and fiber exploded into his face. He rolled left instantly and flattened himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, different sector. A third sniper. George waited 3 full minutes before moving. When he eased back into position, he scanned the southwest tree line. The shooter would have relocated immediately after firing. That was basic doctrine. Shoot once. Move. But jungle terrain limited options. Dense growth narrowed fields of fire and escape routes. At 11:38, George saw him. Third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans. 73 feet up. The sniper had shifted to another branch, but stayed in the same tree, a fatal mistake. George centered the crosshairs and fired. The third sniper fell silently. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word traveled fast through the battalion. Men who had mocked the mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch. George refused. Spectators attracted attention. Attention brought bullets. After the 5th kill, the remaining Japanese snipers adapted. They stopped moving in daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing motionless trees, seeing nothing but leaves and shadow. At 1,600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The sarcasm was gone. He told George to be back in position at first light. January 23rd opened with heavy tropical rain. Sheets of water turned the jungle floor into mud and erased visibility beyond 100 yards. George waited in the bunker, unmoving, letting the storm pass. The rain stopped at 8:15. By 8:45, the jungle began to breathe again. At 9:12, George spotted the first sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The rain had covered their movement. This sniper had chosen a tree nearly 300 yards out, longer range than any from the previous day. He wasn't guessing. He was adapting. The Japanese were learning what George could do and adjusting accordingly. George compensated for distance, settled the crosshairs, and fired. The sniper fell. The sixth kill triggered a response George hadn't expected. At 9:57 a.m., Japanese mortars began dropping around the bunker. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo walked into 20 yards. They weren't firing blind. They had triangulated his position, either by muzzle flash or sound. George didn't wait for the third adjustment. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line, boots slipping in mud, lungs burning. He dove into a shell crater just as the third salvo arrived. The bunker he had occupied seconds earlier vanished in a storm of explosions, timber, and flying earth. When the smoke settled, there was nothing left of it. George crawled out and relocated again, this time to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed position. The trunk provided cover and a clear view into the groves. He settled in and resumed watching. The Japanese responded aggressively that afternoon. More snipers moved into the area. They knew now that someone was hunting them, and they were hunting him in return. The balance had shifted. This was no longer one-sided target shooting. This was a duel. At 2:23 p.m., George killed his seventh sniper. At 3:41 p.m., he killed his eighth. That one had climbed high, 94 feet up a banyan. Excellent concealment. But height betrayed him. As the sun shifted, the sniper's silhouette briefly cut against the sky. That was all George needed. At 5 p.m., Captain Morris sent a runner. George had been in position for 9 hours. At headquarters, Morris asked for numbers. George gave them calmly. 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired. For misses. The battalion commander nodded and told him to be back in position at first light on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester carefully and ran the math in his head. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were dead. 3 remained. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived longest, who had learned fastest. And now they knew exactly who George was, exactly what rifle he carried, and roughly where he liked to operate. George loaded 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 a.m., he gave up. He sat in his tent with the Winchester across his lap as rain began again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough to delay dawn operations. George used the weather to move. Not back to the bunker. Not to the fallen tree. Somewhere they wouldn't expect. He chose a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south of his last position, an old Marine machine gun nest from December. The rocks offered solid cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. George settled in and waited. At 7:43 a.m., the rain eased to a drizzle. Visibility returned. George raised his scope and began glassing the trees. At 8:17 a.m. on January 24th, George spotted sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree roughly 190 yards out. Low, only 40 feet up. That alone was unusual. Most snipers climbed high for commanding sight lines. This one had chosen concealment instead. The palm fronds formed a natural blind, nearly invisible from ground level. But George wasn't on the ground. From the rocks, his elevated angle let him see down into the fronds. The dark outline of shoulders. The curve of a helmet. A clean shot. George brought the rifle up, settled the crosshairs, began to squeeze. Then stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He had killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make amateur mistakes. They would not expose themselves to an elevated shooter unless they wanted to be seen. Unless it was bait. George lowered the rifle and began searching. If the palm sniper was a decoy, the real shooter would be covering him, watching for muzzle flash, waiting to fire the instant George revealed himself. George glassed the surrounding trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. Every trunk, every fork, every shadow. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found him. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The sniper was perfectly hidden, branches and vines masking him from 3 directions. From that position, he had a clear line of sight to George's old location at the fallen tree. He was watching the wrong place. That created 2 problems. If George fired at the real sniper first, the sound would give away his position. The Japanese soldier would relocate before George could cycle the bolt. But if George waited, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and begin searching. George chose a third option. He used the bait. George aimed at the decoy in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The sniper jerked and fell through the fronds. George immediately swung the rifle toward the banyan. The real sniper reacted exactly as expected, turning toward the sound. That movement broke concealment for a fraction of a second. Enough. George fired before the man could fully pivot. The sniper fell. His rifle followed, clattering through branches before disappearing into the undergrowth. 2 shots. 2 kills. But now George's position was exposed. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and moved fast, east along the rock line, boots slipping on wet stone. 40 yards away, he dropped into a drainage ditch and pressed himself into the mud, hard hammering. He had killed 10. 1 sniper remained. And now that sniper knew exactly where to look. George pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire tore into the rocks he had abandoned 6 seconds earlier. Bullets shattered stone. Dust exploded into the air. Fragments whipped across the position. The burst lasted 17 seconds, long enough to kill anyone still there. George did not move. When the firing stopped, he counted slowly to 60. Then he crawled. He relocated 100 yards east to a shell crater half filled with rainwater. The water rose to his chest as he eased himself down. He rested the Winchester on the rim, muzzle steady, body submerged, breath controlled. 10 confirmed kills. 1 remaining. The last sniper would not make mistakes. He had watched 10 men die over 3 days. He knew George's habits. He knew the rifle. He knew where George had been. And somewhere nearby, he was watching. George scanned through the scope. The Lyman Alaskan brought distant shapes closer, but offered no forgiveness. Every shadow could be bark or bone, branch or man. He studied each patch of darkness patiently, refusing to rush. At 9:47, he realized the error. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground. George caught the movement in his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low and deliberate. A shape slipping through undergrowth, parallel to the tree line. Ferns parted. Vines shifted. Fallen branches compressed under careful weight. The Japanese sniper was crawling, using the jungle floor instead of the canopy. Learning. Adapting. George did not move. The Winchester was already shouldered, but the crater rim blocked the angle. To fire, George would have to rise. To rise meant exposure. The sniper stopped at 9:52, 40 yards from the rocks. George watched him study the position, eyes scanning, rifle ready, searching for movement where George had once been, waiting for the slightest mistake. George waited too. Patience was the real weapon. The discipline to let minutes stretch, to resist the urge to act, to trust that the moment would come. At 9:58, the sniper moved again. 35 yards. 30. 25. He approached from the south, the exact route George had taken when evacuating under machine gun fire. He had seen it. He was retracing it, hunting George the same way George had hunted the others. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. And George understood something clearly. This was no longer about shooting first. This was about who would break stillness first. The Japanese sniper climbed into the old machine gun nest and settled in, facing east, toward the drainage ditch where George should have been. He was 38 yards from George's actual position. His back was exposed. Center mass at 38 yards was not a difficult shot. George could have made it without a scope, without thinking. The Winchester rested steady on the crater rim. The man was unaware. One squeeze, and it would be over. George did not fire. This sniper had survived 10 days in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 others. Men who died because they rushed, because they trusted bad ground, because they stayed too long in exposed positions. This man would not make those mistakes. The machine gun nest was too obvious, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper stayed there longer than necessary. It was bait. George kept the crosshairs on the man in the rocks, but widened his focus. If this was a decoy, the real danger would be covering the position, somewhere with a clear line of sight to anyone who fired. At 10:06, George found him. 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk, lay a second Japanese soldier. He wasn't shifting, wasn't scanning. He was waiting, rifle already aimed at the drainage ditch George was supposed to be hiding in. 2 men, not one. Either the 11th sniper had brought protection, or these were the last 2 survivors working together, adapting faster than the others had. George calculated the problem instantly. He could not shoot both. The Winchester was bolt action. 1 shot meant working the bolt. That fraction of a second would give the second man time to trace the muzzle blast and return fire. He needed patience, not speed. George eased himself deeper into the crater. The water rose over his chest, his shoulders, until only his eyes and the crown of his head remained above the surface. He angled the Winchester upward to keep the barrel dry. His muscles burned as he held still. Then he waited. At 10:13, the man in the rocks stood. 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch. Nothing. No movement. No target. He believed George had moved farther east. The sniper turned and signaled. The second man behind the fallen tree responded immediately. Both began moving east, parallel to one another, 70 yards apart, executing a sweep, methodical and deliberate, intending to flush George out or stumble onto him. George did not move. The 2 Japanese soldiers passed his water-filled crater without ever seeing him. They were now walking past the place where he lay submerged, rifle ready, breath controlled, waiting for the moment they would finally make a mistake. They were between George and the tree now. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water. Slowly, silently. The Winchester came to his shoulder as water streamed from the barrel, from his sleeves, from his face. He ignored it. The rifle was steady. He chose the nearer man, the one who had been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier collapsed without a sound. George worked the bolt by feel, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second man behind the fallen tree. The Japanese soldier was already turning, rifle coming up. George fired first. The second man fell. 11 shots over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. The Point Cruz groves were quiet again. The threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours was finished. George climbed out of the crater to recover his spent cartridges. Then he froze. Voices. Japanese voices. Close, multiple, moving through the tree. George dropped back into the crater instantly. Mud and cold water swallowed him as he submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. He held the Winchester straight up, keeping the barrel clear. The voices grew louder. 6 men at least. Maybe more. These weren't snipers. Too loud. Too careless. Infantry, probably a patrol or recovery team sent to retrieve the bodies. George counted seconds. The voices stopped near the first body, 42 yards away. Close enough that he could hear individual words, urgency in their tone, even if he couldn't understand the language. Then the voices moved to the second body. More talking. Faster now. At 10:28, the voices shifted again, this time toward him. Not back to the trees. Toward the crater. They had found his tracks. Boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks straight to the water. George cursed himself silently. He'd controlled sound. He'd controlled movement. He hadn't controlled the ground. He checked his rifle. 5 rounds left. At least 6 enemy soldiers. A bolt-action rifle was a poor weapon for what was coming. Stay hidden and hope they passed, or fight. The voices closed in. 30 yards. 25. 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the rim of the crater. He looked down. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward out of sight. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, then surged upward. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired. Worked the bolt. Fired again. Both men dropped. 3 rounds left. Shouting erupted. Boots pounded. More soldiers were moving toward him. George vaulted out of the crater on the north side, away from the voices. He ran 20 yards and threw himself behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets tore into the mud around the crater and slammed into the log shielding George. They were firing at sound, at movement, blind, panicked fire. George stayed low. He brought the Winchester up again, settled behind the scope, and searched for the next shape that moved. 2 Japanese soldiers advanced toward the crater. 50 yards out, George settled the Winchester against the fallen tree, found the lead man in his scope, and fired. The soldier dropped. The second man dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard voices behind him, more than before. The sound pattern was wrong. One group was moving in from the south, another from the east. They were flanking him. This was no longer a sniper duel. This was an infantry sweep. George knew the math instantly. A bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons was a losing equation. If he stayed, he would be surrounded and killed. He broke contact. George grabbed the Winchester and ran north. The jungle tore at him as he sprinted. Vines snagged his boots. Branches lashed his face. Japanese rifle fire followed. Sharp cracks behind him as bullets snapped past, slammed into trunks, threw dirt into the air. He ran for 90 seconds, lungs burning, legs churning, then dove into another shell crater. This one was dry. George pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The firing stopped. Voices were distant now, confused, clustered around their dead. No pursuit. They were regrouping. George checked his rifle. Mud streaked the stock. Water still dripped from the barrel. 2 rounds left. No stripper clips. His pack, with the ammunition, was back near the water-filled crater. He wasn't going back for it. At 10:47, George began moving again. Not running. Walking. Staying low. Using the ground. Every step deliberate. He angled northeast toward American lines. The jungle was quiet again. No voices. No movement. Only his breathing and the distant, steady rumble of artillery. At 11:13, he reached the perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry waved him through. George went straight to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris wanted everything. George gave it to him. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired at sniper targets. 11 hits. Then the infantry engagement. 3 more kills in close contact. Morris asked about ammunition. George told him the truth. 2 rounds left. Morris asked about the rifle. Functional, George said, but dirty. Mud in the action. Water in the barrel. Morris nodded. Clean it. Rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. Intelligence indicated the Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Withdrawal likely complete within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He field-stripped the Winchester and worked for 2 hours. Cosmoline. Gun oil. Patch after patch through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 1,400 hours, word arrived from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George. He walked to headquarters expecting trouble. Unauthorized engagements. Operating alone. Excessive ammunition use. Maybe even a reprimand. Instead, he found Captain Morris waiting with 2 other officers. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry didn't waste time. He asked one question. Can you train other men to do what you did? George answered honestly. He said he could try, but it would take time. It would require rifles with optics. And it would require men who could already shoot, not just qualify on paper. Ferry nodded. Division had 14 Springfield rifles fitted with unertl scopes, Marine sniper rifles left behind earlier in the campaign. Ferry also had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. He wanted George to build a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George agreed, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved it without hesitation. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 scoped Springfields went to the men he would train. Training began on January 27th. George assembled 40 men at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. On paper, they were experts, men who had qualified with iron sights out to 500 yards. But none of them had combat experience as snipers. None had killed from concealment. George started with fundamentals. Breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with their unertl scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made them stable, but exhausting to hold for long periods. George taught the men to use anything available for support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to create stability from whatever terrain gave them. Range training lasted 3 days. They shot stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams: shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets, provide security, and call corrections. After each engagement, roles could switch. That kept both men sharp and eliminated single points of failure. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was simple: clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikaw River. Intelligence reported small groups of Japanese soldiers still operating there, not snipers, just infantry stragglers who hadn't evacuated. The teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with Corporal Hayes as his spotter. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt and scanned for movement. None came. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss, wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. The sniper section worked exactly as George had designed it. 23 Japanese soldiers were killed that day. There were 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operating through early February. By February 9th, George's men had killed 74 Japanese soldiers. The number was deliberately conservative. Only confirmed kills where the body could be observed and identified were counted. The effect was immediate. Japanese evacuation efforts accelerated. Destroyers began arriving at night off Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal, loading troops under cover of darkness. American units pushed west to cut off the retreat, but Japanese rearguard actions were disciplined and effective. Snipers and riflemen covered withdrawal routes, delaying advances and protecting embarkation points. George's sniper section was assigned to eliminate those rearguard elements. On February 7th, near the Tenaru, Bow River area, George was moving with Hayes when a Japanese rifleman fired from concealment. The round struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him sideways and knocked him to the ground. Hayes reacted instantly. He dragged George into cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but survivable. The bullet had passed cleanly through muscle without striking bone or major blood vessels. At the field hospital near Henderson Field, doctors cleaned the wound, sutured it closed, and told George he would recover fully. But not immediately. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks in the field hospital. While he recovered, the campaign ended. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The Japanese evacuation was complete. Guadalcanal was finally secure. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. Division headquarters formally recognized the section's performance. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war was not over. While he was still recovering, new orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a classified mission. Somewhere else. Somewhere harder. Burma. George volunteered without hesitation. By March, he was aboard a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth, secured like something fragile and irreplaceable. George didn't know the details of the mission, only that it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines. The kind of war where a man with a rifle capable of hitting targets at 600 yards might matter. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They were being assembled into a new unit, 3,000 men in total. The unit didn't have an official designation yet, but the men already had a name for themselves. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. Officially, they were the 5,307th Composite Unit, provisional, designated on May 28th, 1943. Unofficially, the name had existed for weeks already. The men had been training since April, pushed hard from the moment they arrived in India. This was not conventional infantry training. They learned long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, movement without supply lines, living off what they carried and what they could find. The unit was modeled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits, small, mobile forces designed to operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role was not listed as sniper. The U.S. Army had no formal sniper positions in its table of organization. On paper, George was a rifle platoon leader. But Colonel Ferry's recommendation from Guadalcanal had followed him across the Pacific. Battalion command knew exactly what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the fundamentals were the same: heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. Burma would be worse. Steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, an enemy that knew the ground better than any American unit ever would. George modified his equipment for what was coming. The Winchester Model 70 had performed flawlessly on Guadalcanal, but those operations were short and supported. Burma would mean patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles through jungle. Every ounce mattered. He removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. Same 2.5 power magnification, 8 ounces lighter. He replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version. The changes reduced the rifle's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. It wasn't much, but over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of gear, every ounce mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their mission was to advance through northern Burma and capture Myitkyina airfield, a critical node for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces controlled the area with roughly 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland through terrain the Japanese considered impassable for large formations. Mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, few trails. Everything was carried on their backs or by pack mules. No motorized transport, no artillery support, just rifles, mortars, and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion began the march on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases increased daily. Pack mules struggled on steep descents. Several had to be shot after breaking legs and becoming immobile. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They had engaged Japanese forces 12 times. The fights were small and violent. Ambushes, sharp firefights, then immediate withdrawal. The Marauders were not meant to hold ground. They were meant to move, to harass, to cut supply lines, to create chaos deep behind Japanese positions. And somewhere in that jungle, moving with a rifle built for precision rather than volume of fire, was John George, already proven on Guadalcanal, now heading into the most demanding campaign of his war. If you're ready, send the next part, and I'll rewrite it in the same style. George used his Winchester only 3 times during the march. Once at 412 yards, killing a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards, silencing a machine gun position. Once at 290 yards, eliminating a sniper who had pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. George never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, deeper and heavier than the Garand's sharp crack. 1 shot announced his presence. A second would give the Japanese time to locate him. George learned to shoot and move immediately, disappearing before return fire could find him. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered more than 700 miles on foot. They lost more men to disease than to combat: malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 5,300 men was reduced to fewer than 3,000 effectives. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The mission succeeded. The unit did not. The Marauders were combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too much sickness, too long in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George survived Burma. His Winchester survived with him. But the rifle that had proven so deadly on Guadalcanal was used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. Burma did not favor long-range precision shooting. Most combat happened inside 50 yards, sudden ambushes in vegetation so dense visibility rarely exceeded 30 feet. During those months, George reached a conclusion. The Winchester Model 70 was an exceptional rifle, perhaps the finest bolt-action sporting rifle ever built. But warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the M1 Garand were becoming the standard. Future wars would demand different weapons and different tactics. There would be no next war for George. Not immediately. By June 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the remaining marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. He returned home in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia, where he trained infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught what he had learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma, how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. And he kept his rifle. The Winchester Model 70 had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, and back to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, probably more. A civilian rifle, carried into war against orders, and proven, one shot at a time. George stopped counting after Burma. The rifle went into a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. He rarely opened it. The war was changing. The Pacific Islands were falling one by one. American forces were driving through France and into Germany. Warfare was becoming industrial, standardized equipment, interchangeable parts, identical rifles, identical training. George understood why. Modern war required scale. But something else was disappearing. Individual skill. Craftsmanship. The idea that one man, properly trained, with the right rifle, could change the outcome of a fight. In January 1947, George left the Army. Lieutenant Colonel. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 Purple Heart. Combat Infantryman Badge. He went home to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. He studied politics and graduated with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, he spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 more years in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions. Eventually, he settled in Washington, D.C. He became executive director of the Institute of African American Relations, then later a consultant and lecturer at the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute, specializing in African affairs. During those years, George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma. Colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific. They did not know about Point Cruz. They did not know about the snipers. They did not know about the Winchester Model 70 sitting quietly in a case in his home. In 1947, George decided to write everything down. Not for publication, not for recognition, just for accuracy. He wanted a record of jungle warfare, of weapons, ammunition, ballistics, tactics, while the details were still precise. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to more than 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and urged him to publish. George hesitated. The manuscript was technical, clinical, detailed. Rifles, ammunition, sight pictures, bullet behavior. Not the kind of book meant for mass appeal. The NRA convinced him. The book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic, not because it glorified combat, but because it refused to. No hero language, no embellishment, just facts. What worked, what failed, what mattered under fire. The book remains in print today. It is still cited by historians and collectors studying World War II small arms. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain among the most detailed contemporary accounts ever written. George lived long enough to watch the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. He watched rifles evolve from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated schools, doctrine, and equipment. He watched the lessons of World War II rediscovered, slowly, carefully, by new generations. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a glass case with a small placard. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like an ordinary vintage hunting rifle. It is not. It is the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion could not do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that helped change how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. Quiet, unassuming, decisive, just like the man who carried it.